going, everybody? Welcome to the show. This is Thursday, August 6th. I'm Carter Hammond. This is locally sourced. Usually I won't do this part until the end, but I just want to take a moment to say please hit up our Patreon. It's patreon.com/locally sourced. You can support this channel there. Bop down below, hit subscribe. Little bell will give you notifications anytime we go live, but I just want to sort of let everybody know this is completely viewer supported. So no big interests here. Today I am just so excited. I mean, I'm always excited, really. Like every time I do this, I get excited about who I get to have on, because I'm just having conversations with people that are really making things happen. But today I've got Andru Volinsky on, and he is currently an executive counselor, and he's running for governor in the Democratic primary. And I am really excited to speak with him about a number of different issues. I will give the caveat before I start. We won't really be getting into environmental issues today. And the reason I'm not doing that is not because I don't care, but because generally speaking, I would tell everybody to look at the endorsements that Andru has received when it comes to environment, because that speaks enough. And I don't really feel like there's a whole lot more that I need to say about it right now, and I would much rather dedicate a totally different stream at a totally different time to do nothing but environment. So I just kind of wanted to get that off the table really quick. But for now, I'd like to bring on Andru Volinsky. Andru, how are you today?
I'm fine. Good morning, Carter. Thank you for having me.
Hey, no problem. It's a total honor. I know you're a really busy guy, and I just appreciate you taking the time to come out here and talk a little bit. I mean, do you want to take a minute to just sort of give your argument for why you're running for governor?
Sure. So Andru Volinsky, I'm candidate for governor. Many people know that I was the Claremont school funding lawyer. I've proven in that case that I'm capable of challenging the status quo, particularly when it comes to property taxes and improving the quality of our schools. Claremont was a big deal. It was a bold idea, but for lack of courageous leadership, we've never really fulfilled the promise of Claremont. So seniors are still worried about losing their homes. Taxpayers are taxed unfairly. School quality varies greatly around our state, and young and working class families can't get into their homes because we are worst in the nation in reliance on the property tax to fund important services. When I first went to Claremont to meet with people, it was a lot like going home for me. I grew up in a mill town where the mill failed. My dad was a mechanic and a maintenance man and a union shop steward. My mother was a homemaker. I'm the only one in my family to have gone to college. I went on scholarship. I paid for law school by working as a carpenter. I know the importance of educational opportunity. It's really a question of economic justice. And that's why I fought so hard for almost 30 years to fulfill the promise of Claremont. That's why I won't take the pledge. The pledge is a promise to fail. And I think it's time, for lots of reasons that I hope we'll go into this morning, to think that New Hampshire is ready for this conversation. So I want to move forward on that. I know we're not going to mention climate change, but I am endorsed by the Sierra Club, 350.org, New Hampshire Youth Climate Strike, New Hampshire Youth Movement, the Sunrise Movements, a number of others, because I am very strong on combating climate change and on promoting the environment. So that's who I am. I hope you'll listen in, and that you'll enjoy this podcast as much as I know I will enjoy doing it. So let's get started, Carl.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. Great. This is awesome. Thanks for that intro, and I think that's a really solid frame, because it gives us a good point of context for just about everything that we're going to discuss. So,
okay.
Let me just. There are a few things got touched on, and we'll get to them a little later. But what I want to start with is, On your website, under the issues section regarding healthcare, you indicated that, quote, 30 years ago, we had a model community-based mental health system widely considered to be one of the best in the nation. Unfortunately, a series of state budget cuts has eroded our mental health system into one of the nation's worst, and has led to dire situations like the abuse that occurred at the notorious Laconia State Hospital. So the reality, though, is that much was still not well understood about mental health, and while deinstitutionalization was instrumental in moving forward public attitudes about mental health, the decision to move care and treatment into a more community-based solution set seems to show the cracks in community literacy regarding the importance of understanding and assimilating folks who experience challenges with their mental health. Many movements within the community of people who experience disability have changed the conversation in recent years, altering the frame to one that accounts for neurodiversity and acceptance. You say, quote, New Hampshire has done mental health care right before, and we can do it again. And there's absolutely truth to that. But do you feel it's worth taking some time to examine that system from 30 years ago some more, and perhaps engage with the aspect of educating communities on how to involve and incorporate neurodiversity, how that may have played a large role in the lack of support for government subsidy of programs that would have helped bridge this gap, and instead relies on like non-governmental organizations, nonprofit community organizations, and they're also historically underfunded, and a lot of that money doesn't necessarily come from government subsidy. There's, grants, and they're separate institutions that will fund this. So it's the question itself focuses more on educating communities on how to work with this. Like, that seems like we might have missed dealing with that part of it.
Well, there's a lot to unpack in that question, Carter.
Mm-hmm.
So let's start here. The Laconia State School was an abject failure. We locked up people for long periods of time because we had no understanding, or we acted as if there was no understanding of developmental disabilities, of mental health issues, and that the preferred response was to lock people away and institutionalize them at a place that was called the Laconia State School. Closing that school, that institution, was the right thing to do. We built a community mental health system under a guy from your area, Don Shumway, who most recently led Crotched Mountain before he retired. Nation leading, thoughtful, moving people out of an institution into community in a way that respected their needs and respected the needs of the communities into which they were moving. We stopped investing in that, and it withered and died to the point where we, a couple of years ago, had virtually no community mental health system, developmental disabilities waiting list, all sorts of problems, problems with homelessness, problems with using the police as social workers. All of that is related. This is a big constellation of issues that we need to address piece by piece, but keeping in mind the issue as a whole. So thinking about it that way. Homelessness. The approach of housing first makes good sense. You stabilize where people are living, you add case management to that stable living environment, and now we have a platform from which people can grow and maintain their presence in a healthy way in the community. So right now, I see these contracts as an executive counselor. New Hampshire puts almost no money into combating homelessness. The money comes from federal grants, essentially. The federal grants are great, but they're not enough. We need to devote some more resources, and it's a smart investment. The more we can stabilize people who are homeless, address the various needs that need addressing, the more we keep them out of the criminal justice system. And that's a very expensive, very inhumane way to deal with what at bottom may be mental health issues. So invest in dealing with homelessness. Um, Doing better at schools. A lot of times, the issues that mature later in life can be picked up at schools. We have a system of special education funding that perversely puts the responsibility for most of that funding on the local school district. So if a family with a high needs special ed child moves into your community without notice, your special ed budget is blown for the year. That puts too much on the locals. It's not the fault of the family that's moved in. It's the fault of the structure that the schools are placed in. That should be a state funded responsibility so that it doesn't matter where the child's family moves to or when they move. The money from the state can move with them and the services can be maintained in a way that helps the child grow and improve and achieve whatever the child is capable of achieving. And you mentioned neurodiversity. We need to respect that not everyone is going to come out of school, K-12 school, in the same place, in the same way, or have the same path for the rest of their lives. And so understanding and respecting that, we need to have options. Starting at school, you know that special education starts pre-K. We need to have pre-K available for more than children with designated IEPs. We need to make pre-K available in a universal way. Other states have done that. New Hampshire barely has gotten kindergarten universally available. Georgia has universal pre-K. It's a boon to get kids going in the right direction. So we need to think about things like that. The actual mental health system needs to be funded. Um, we have an opioid crisis. Lots of people suffering with substance abuse disorder issues. I sat in the executive council when Chris Sununu told us he invented in a dream the hub and spoke system for treating opioid addictions. And I sat there knowing that Vermont had the hub and spoke system 5 years before we did. So I don't know what Sununu was dreaming or what he was smoking at the time, but I went to Vermont and said, how's your system work? Where are the problems? Which is what a leader should do. And here's what they told me. It's relatively easy to stand up the hubs because you usually build them around a hospital that already exists. The problem is the spokes into the communities. We often have communities with an insufficient number of providers, not because they don't want to be there, they don't want to live there, but our Medicaid reimbursement levels are so low that they can't afford to be in certain parts of the state. So you'll hear people bragging about how we did a 3% increase on Medicaid reimbursement rates last budget. That moved us from last to last in the nation in Medicaid reimbursement rates. We need to do a lot better so that we can rebuild this kind of vibrant community mental health system. So you ask for deep dives.
No, I like it. I like it.
Let's
well, I mean, I just like a takeaway that I have from what you've said so far is the idea that this idea that it's all connected, right? That there's a line between all of it. And the notable thing about what you're pointing out is that these are all systems that affect things. And the resolution is essentially social programs that will deal with this as administered by a government. And it's not necessarily about spending more money so much as it's spending money wisely. Like if we're, it's not like we can't find a way to fund this stuff in an equitable way, but it's important that we do it, because if we sit here and we try to deal with it as like in the example of police officers as a multi-tool, right? Like that's something that's come up in my community. And it's this notion that we have a problem and we're dealing with it after it occurs rather than trying to think about the base solution, which is funding hospitals, making sure that there's resources in communities, solving the homeless problem. Like, that's because it comes down to me ultimately to food, water, shelter, and health. You know, it's basic human needs. But please,
Yeah.
I continue. I don't want to hold it up. I just want
So
to be like,
Maslow was right? So, but let me give you a concrete example. And you can't change these systems on a dime. It takes some time. But if you incarcerate someone at the state prison, it costs about $37,000 a year. If instead you put them on probation or parole with a shortened prison sentence, it's $15,000 a year. So if we took money and hired more probation and parole supervising officers, we created better places for people to live, we created better employment opportunities, we could invest less as a state and get more bang for our buck. That's just one example of how, if we're smart about this and invest early, and this is a fundamental change that's worth noting, Carter. Too often, we think of every governmental expense as a cost to be minimized. And in truth, some governmental expenses are investments, and you nurture your investments. You don't minimize the money going there. And it's important that we make that distinction as we consider state programs, particularly since we're going to be looking at financial shortfalls. That's going to require federal money to come in to fill holes. But Sununu's first move is to talk about, who am I going to cut 20%? That is not how you lead. We need to be really careful how we go forward in this economic crisis.
yeah. And I think, something else that I always consider when I hear something like that is that what what the Republicans are doing is they're saying the act of cutting is the gift, right? But it's weird because typically when you take something away, you have to offer something to replace it. And I feel like that's genuinely what the effort that you're making here is not to say we're going to fight something. It's not based off of something that needs to go away, that's problematic or that we're against, but rather framing the campaign in a context of here's what we're going to do. It's like, it's optimistic by nature.
I think we're generally an optimistic society, that we can overcome obstacles in our way. And it's the job of our leaders to provide direction for that optimism. But let me take a slightly different take on what you just said.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not only that Sununu and the Republican leadership don't offer something in return for something that's being taken away.
Mm-hmm.
What they do is they downshift the responsibility from the state to the local community. And that means it can only be paid for by the local property tax, which is the most broad-based tax we have. Everyone who lives here pays it directly or indirectly, and it's one of the most unfair taxes. So we need to have that conversation front and center. When we came out of the 2008 recession, the following 3 years, the local property tax went up $294 million. Mm-hmm. And that's because everything that Speaker O'Brien could downshift to the local community, he did.
Right.
Pension costs, roads and bridges, all sorts of things. And different communities have different abilities to respond to that.
Right, exactly. Well, let's take this moment then to, I'm going to hop a little bit. So in regards to this, I still have yet to find a way to engage in a meaningful conversation about education in this state that doesn't involve talking about property tax. And you've essentially spent the last couple of years just going around the state explaining this relationship. Why are we unable to solve the education problem without solving our broad-based tax problem? And why are we not able to supplementally fund from additional means adequately, like using the business profits tax? Or if we were to legalize marijuana, why would the sales not adequately cover that expense? How do we dismantle the framing of more or less taxes and replace it with one that promotes fair taxation, so that it's easier or less taboo for us to have a more meaningful conversation about introducing some sort of different type of broad-based tax? And what type of like, if we were to do that, what type of tax would you argue is the most equitable while raising the most money?
So let's start here. My good friends John Tobin and Doug Hall. Doug's a former legislator, Republican, and economist. John was the executive director of New Hampshire Legal Assistance and one of my co-counsel in the Claremont school funding cases. The three of us went around the state and held north of 60 forums just explaining how school funding works. We called it Ed Funding 101. We held these forums all across the state, Keene to Rochester, Berlin to Nashua. Over 3,000 people attended. And the purpose, well, let me tell you where it came from. A community near Concord, Pittsfield, rural community, small community, had just gone through its most painful latest round of budget cuts for its schools. And it was contemplating suing the state because the state has never complied with Claremont. And since I'm holding elected office, I can't sue the state. I am the state in some respects. But I knew the school board members in Pittsfield and the superintendent, and they called me in. Would you explain what's involved in a lawsuit? So I met with them and explained it. And I said, this is a huge undertaking for your community. If you're going to do it, have a community meeting, have a forum. John and I'll come. We'll explain how school funding works and how you're stuck in a system that doesn't give you options and doesn't help you. And the system is at fault, not your school board. So mid-June night, two years ago, we held this forum, and more than 125 people showed up from all across the state. And we wound up being invited to communities all across the state as a result. And here's the takeaway. The Claremont cases established that it's the state's responsibility to fund K-12 public education. It doesn't belong to the local school district. It's the state's responsibility. And because it's the state's responsibility, the taxes that go to pay for schools need to be uniform all across the state, which clearly doesn't happen because the state reneges on its responsibility. Schools are funded 73% at the local level, still almost 30 years after Claremont. That's where the problem lies. So under this system, school funding is just a math problem. Let's assume the property in your community is worth $10. I'm dropping a bunch of zeros. And you have a $2 tax rate. You raise $20 for your schools. But if your property is only worth $2 and you levy the same $2 tax rate, you raise $4. Even if you double your tax rate to 4, you're only raising 8. You're still far behind. But now you've made your community less attractive to business and to home construction because your taxes are so high. That's the spiral that almost every community's in, except for the most wealthy. That's the cycle we need to break. Yeah. And until we break that cycle, schools cost money. Right. Let's be clear on that.
Yeah, and just to point out for folks, if anyone wants to understand where this legacy is at right now that Andrew's talking about, I would tell people to look up the lawsuit that Conval is currently involved with versus the state. That's kind of the next chapter in this story, and the rulings surrounding that. But please continue. I just kind of wanted to plug that
Yep.
as like, I went to school at Conval, but it's like they are really at the center of it right now.
Yeah, absolutely. They filed a new lawsuit maybe 2 years ago, and it's working its way to the Supreme Court. The trial judge found that the state is still not complying
Right,
with the Claremont decisions in that case.
right,
So we need a fairer, state oriented source of funding, one that will have someone like Mitt Romney pay his fair share. So Mitt Romney's got a $10 million estate on the lake in Wolfboro. His tax rate is about $7. In all of the Conval communities, the tax rate is about $20. Mitt Romney should pay his fair share. So the goal of any change would be to reduce property taxes for most of New Hampshire's citizens and have those who aren't paying their fair share start to pay their fair share. There are different ways you can do it. My job as governor, starting with my inaugural speech, if I'm lucky enough to be elected, is to use the bully pulpit to push the legislature to come up with a package that can make it through the legislature to my desk. There are different ways to do it. Each of the approaches has pros and cons. I understand that, but the idea that the current system can continue to exist is unacceptable and it's not sustainable. So we need to press our legislators to be honest about this. I'm in this campaign in the primary, and my opponent, Dan Feltus, says we passed the most progressive education budget in all time in the last legislature. New Hampshire's 50th in state funding for public education. 50th, we're worst in the nation. So this great progressive budget isn't. And we need to just start being honest with people. And, the one point of dishonesty that I'll mention is the New Hampshire lottery. You've all seen the commercials. The New Hampshire lottery pays for public education. Well, in truth, the New Hampshire lottery pays for 2.5% of the cost of public education. It's not nothing, but that's hardly paying for public education. And you gotta understand, if you want nice things, you need to pay for them. And education is one of the most important investments we can make.
I just want to sort of throw in here that like something that you just alluded to, that is a message that I want to send along to folks who are just consuming news and hearing talking points and stuff like that, is it always take a moment to further interrogate it, because your point about Dan talking about the most progressive legislation, right? Like that type of normalizing is really, it's easy to get wooed into it because it's positivity, right? And we like to think that we're doing better or we're making progress, and it's not necessarily I think when when we on the left come at a more center position that says something like that, and we're like, hey, this isn't good enough, it's not that we're like, we don't like them. You know what I mean? It's not like we aren't willing to build coalition, because I think that's often the response that this gets, is like, how do you expect to work together with people? And I guess to that, right, you mentioned that you're going to use the bully pulpit to pressure the legislature to come up with a solution for education funding. And I'm curious, do you have any type of actual strategy for that messaging that you're considering right now that would be an effective use of that? The only reason I bring it up is that this is something that has, Lynch failed to do this himself. So it's like, there is the question of how much can be done with that. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I think you need to treat voters and constituents and citizens as adults able to advocate for themselves. And you need to give them some tools. So the Department of Education has a website with a bunch of financial data on it.
Mm-hmm.
One of the reports there shows how much every community in the state has had its property taxes increased over time. You can look it up.
Mm-hmm.
And so in the inaugural speech, I will say Manchester went up by this much. Manchester pays twice as much as this community, yet Manchester has the lowest school funding per pupil in the state. And Manchester is the most diverse with a lot of free and reduced lunch kids. That means your needs are higher in Manchester than in other places.
Mm-hmm.
And you probably should spend more, not less.
Yeah.
So here's what's happened. And I'm not picking on Manchester at all, but it really does crystallize the issue. 18 months, 2 years ago, the business community in Manchester came together to form Manchester Proud. In
Mm-hmm.
part, that's a civic engagement, good for them. In part, it's because they couldn't get employees to live in Manchester because the schools were so challenged. And they realized that. So they're stepping up to try and help the schools. But whatever they can do, all the rah rah stuff is really good. But unless you fundamentally change the revenue structure, Manchester's never going to get out of this hole. And it will not become the economic engine for our state that it should be.
Right.
So this isn't only bad for Manchester, it's bad for our state as a whole on that. So you give people tools to understand what the system is and how it impacts them, and then you trust them to call their legislators, to write their legislators, to show up at hearings and say, you know what? If you will do this fairly, I will help you do it.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the goal.
Okay, yeah. So that type of like promoting autonomy with folks is that I would say that's a solid strategy, at least in my opinion. But I definitely, I'm it's not to be too just like, hey, like, oh yeah, I co-sign this. But generally speaking, I would say that is a solid approach. I think that's the populist approach tends to be the best when mobilizing voters to actually reach out to their state reps to advocate for, or senators to advocate for the type of policy that they want to see. It builds stronger connection between those particular groups. I do want to sort of like go back a little bit to the question of, business profits tax or legalizing marijuana. Like, why is it so important that we address broad-based tax reform rather than just using supplemental things? I have my own argument for why legalizing cannabis isn't necessarily going to be enough to cover the costs of, say, fully funding education. But I'd like to hear your explanation of that.
Well, look, there are two aspects to the cannabis discussion. One is a justice issue, the other is a money raising issue. We should never confuse the two. Marijuana needs to be legalized in New Hampshire, and we need to expunge the records of people who were convicted of possession. So that part should happen regardless of the money. The money issue is the way to think about it is, I think Jeanne Shaheen, John Lynch, and Maggie Hassan were good, smart, committed governors. They all took the pledge, and so they would never work on a broad-based tax approach. But I believe they were honest and committed to doing the best they could within the existing system. And all three failed with that approach. So at the time of Claremont, we maybe had 10 or 15 school districts in real trouble financially. Now, 77% of the children in our state live in communities with below average property values. That means 77% of the communities are in trouble. It's a big problem and it's gotten a lot worse. So that's number one. There isn't enough money that will come from closing loopholes. We should close loopholes. That's a separate discussion, but there won't be enough money to come out of it. We can't be 73% reliant on the local property tax to pay for education when it's a state responsibility and when we're supposed to have a uniform tax to do that. We have a statewide property tax. Jean Shaheen put it in place in her third term when she did not take the pledge because she wanted to put all of the options on the table. It just has been set at such a low level that no money is generated as a result. That's not spent in the community where the state property tax is imposed. So let me say that a little more clearly. In theory, a statewide property tax could create a central fund from which we could fund schools. What was set up instead was the first dollar that comes from a statewide property tax stays local in that community, and no money goes to a central kitty until all of the local need is taken care of. And so if you set the statewide property tax so low, $2 a thousand, you'll never generate additional money for that central kitty, and that's what's happened. So that could be a method, if it's used right, to make this system more fair. And you can do it in a way where you exempt a portion of a home's value, so you're protecting working class people. You don't want their taxes to go up. But darn it, I think Mitt Romney needs to pay his fair share. And so do all the other people who live on the lakes, live in a ski community, live on the ocean. If you can pay the price of admission to buy an expensive house in one of those communities, you can enjoy some of the lowest tax rates in the state and still have all the services you could ever want in your community. But that's not the way we should do things. That's rigged for the people at the top. Working people have to have a chance so that their kids can go to a great K-12 university. We're not even mentioning that New Hampshire is also worst in the nation in state support for community college and college and university education. That's why we have the highest student debt load in America here. That's why our children often go out of state for college. I'll mention one fact and then turn it back to you, Carter, to follow up. If you go to community college in New Hampshire for a year, your tuition's about $7,600. If you go to community college in Maine, tuition's $2,800, about a third. That makes us not competitive with Maine to keep young people here. It's much cheaper to move to Maine, establish residency, and start your community college education a year later over there. It shouldn't be that way. We should make community college as close to free as possible.
Yeah, I mean, I wholly agree with that. I mean, I think, you know, for my own take on it, it's like, you know, education, like college education is one thing. There's, I mean, I think the property tax really is like, it really is the, you know, I guess maybe for my age group, it's probably the biggest obstacle right now, like specifically my age group, because, you know, at like 31, most of my peers are starting their families and they're looking for a place to settle down. So a lot of my peers are sort of beyond the college point. That does not mean that it is not imperative. And I mean, part of the reason I say that is because, and I've said it on this stream before, that I believe that education is the cornerstone or the keystone of democracy. Without adequate education, everything else is going to fall apart. Because how do you have an informed populace voting on things that are good for them if they, you know, like you don't know what you don't know. At any rate, I really think that it's, in many ways, to your point, like, this is not necessarily a great state to make money, this is a great state to keep money and protect assets. In the example of Mitt Romney, it's like, this is the thing, is you can have an incredibly high income and you can go and get a very modest property that's, it's nice, got high value, but it's not a giant mansion with a whole bunch of sprawling, you know what I mean? Like, it's, a nice little spot on a lake. Yeah, sure. Property taxes are probably high just based off of the value of that property itself, but in proportion to the income of that person or the accumulated wealth of that person, it's fractional. And I just saw a breakdown of Hollis and property taxes and the percentage of income paid in property tax. This was I'll try and send it along to you if you haven't already seen it, but I do believe it's available on the Hollistown website. But at any rate, this is the problem with a regressive tax like a property tax, is that it doesn't deal with equity, right? And I genuinely, again, I have yet to hear an argument that convinces me that we don't need something that relies on the metric of income to determine what is fair to pay. Like, I just don't, I haven't seen it yet. Now, I'm not saying that we need to implement some sort of broad income tax, okay? I personally, ideologically would agree with it because I think it's the most equitable tax. That's my own personal opinion. I would be happy with something that says maybe like circuit breaks the property tax based off of income, right? Like, the idea being that if you're a family that's owned a farm and you can't, it's been in your family for generations and all of a sudden you can't farm that land anymore and you're trying to find a way to get into agribusiness to, rent it out more for like weddings or stuff like, just events. And the state law hasn't fully caught up on what people can do in those spaces yet. So it makes it kind of a grind to figure out how to make money off of that property again. So you're getting away from this traditional concept of back when New Hampshire was farmland and we decided we were going to do a property tax. There was absolutely a direct connection between the amount of money somebody could make and literally how many acres they own. But things aren't like that anymore. But does that then mean that this family that's had this farm in their, passed down through generations all of a sudden doesn't deserve to keep their farm anymore? Like, I think that's preposterous personally. Like, that's a huge problem that I see in communities, is we're always so concerned about drawing people in and we're never thinking about the amount of people that have been here for a really long time that we're pushing out. And I genuinely feel like approaching that problem from a standpoint of income sensitivity is a necessity in order to truly create equity within the tax structure. And what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I've often said that we have an 80s tax system, 1680s.
Yeah.
And your point is absolutely right, that when the property tax system was instituted, the real estate that you owned was a good measure of your wealth because it determined what goods you could produce for the most part. We're far from that, and it's long past time to update. And right now, we're still chained to this pledge from the 1970s. Mel Thompson and William Loeb created it, and politicians have been afraid to challenge it from time to time, with some notable exceptions. And the reason is we've allowed the Republicans to control the narrative. They say you should not have a broad-based tax, but I'm telling you, the most broad-based tax in New Hampshire is the property tax. If you're a homeowner, you pay it directly. If you rent, it's part of your rent and you pay it indirectly. So everyone who lives here pays the property tax. And businesses in New Hampshire pay twice as much in the property tax as they pay in business taxes. So fixing the property tax would be a big help to business development. So a place like Claremont, which has the highest tax rate in the state, it's $42 a thousand. That's double what most of the Conval communities are. If you have a choice to open or expand a business in Claremont or in neighboring Lebanon, where the tax rate is less than half, that's an easy decision to make. You go to Lebanon. So Claremont withers, but Lebanon's full. We should make it easier for people to move to Claremont, establish and grow businesses there, but the property tax system holds them back. And it's not just Claremont. This happens all over the state, and we need to be aware of that, and reverse that kind of limitation.
Yeah, yeah, and I think like this gets to this gets to an idea that I think like I interviewed Emmett Soldati, and I think he had a really good point about this, the way that um, the property tax kind of sets communities against each other in that sense, where if somebody says one bad thing about a community, if that rumor turns into something that spins the whole side of the state, eventually that bad word about what happened on this street will meaningfully drop the value of property if people think it's a bad community. Like, it's actually possible to do that with the way we have things set up. So I think there's a certain amount of reaching out and connecting to communities, that's something that can be done absolutely through small business. And again, it's like, I remember when Steve Marchand was running back in 2018, and he would make the point of like I don't hear businesses saying, oh, please give me a break on my business profits tax. They're like, deal with the property tax. Like, like that's the real problem. Like, I can't I can't get people into my community to employ. Like, I can't, like, this is not the issue. Like, there are a whole different set of issues. And so I want to follow that employment thread for a minute, right? And get into living wage, because I think this is like just
Okay.
this is
Before we
something.
go there,
Yeah,
can I
yeah,
say that
please.
Emmett is a really top-notch small businessman, and gets it.
Yeah,
So I just want to acknowledge that, Emmett is a really serious, good candidate for actually my seat that I'm vacating,
right.
to run for governor, District
Awesome.
2 Executive Counselor. Okay, go
Gotta
ahead to
love the
living
plug.
wage.
No, no, that was good. I'm glad you took a minute to do that. So okay, you advocate for a $15 minimum wage on your issues page, which is far and away better than a gradual increase program that would start at 12 and then get there to 15 by, I think, 2024. A couple questions on this. If wages were to have kept up with inflation, national minimum wage would be, and I just looked this up, according to the AFL-CIO, inflation adjusted minimum wage would be $18.67 an hour. So in many parts of New Hampshire, citizens need to make between $20 and $23 an hour to afford the cost of living. How does $15 an hour sustainably respond to the issue of living costs, which will still be anywhere from $5 to $8 an hour less than full-time at full-time unemployment, to account for that? That's a huge gap. On the other side, folks will argue that $15 an hour is way too ambitious to get through the state house, and that at this, it's legislatively impossible. Can you explain the ideological differences between your argument for $15 an hour now and versus a gradual step up type of program that starts at 12 and gets there over time? And then what kind of message does it send to low income workers in this state to advocate for either of those positions, knowing that the cost of living is still so far below what either of those numbers are at?
Yeah. So let's provide some context. New Hampshire doesn't have a minimum wage under state law, which means we default to the abysmally low $7.25. That's embarrassing. The last two legislatures put a $12 minimum wage on the governor's desk, and he vetoed both. And we knew he was going to veto it. And so I don't understand why you would compromise with yourself if you're a legislative leader, knowing that it's not going to make a difference to Sununu whether you're at $12 or $15. He's against any state minimum wage and is going to veto whatever you put in front of him. So that's point one. It makes no sense to fight for 12 when the right thing is probably in the 20s. New Hampshire, northern New England has a high cost of living. We all know that. Part of that's energy, part of that's climate, part of that's the remote nature, rural nature of our state. There is a national effort built around $15. It's, if you go to any part of the country, you can join the fight for 15. There is benefit in having that national effort as kind of a wind at your back pushing you forward, because you can do some things locally in your progressive communities, but you also can enjoy the support of national groups fighting for 15. So in part, there's an existing branding campaign, an existing progressive campaign, and an existing poor people's, working people's campaign that I want to take advantage of, because it's smart to build on the efforts of other people. You will never hear anyone in the country saying they're fighting for $16.87. It just isn't happening, although the number is right. So I think you need to build, you have to figure out where you can start. You have to figure out who your allies are, what resources are available to launch a campaign to get close to a living wage, and take advantage of those resources. And that's why I'm at $15. It also, not for nothing, I was Bernie Sanders' lawyer in 2016. And one of the things that attracted me to him was his willingness to fight for 15 then, when he was a lonely soul doing it, and had been a lonely soul doing it for quite some time.
Yeah, and I think that's like really what this gets at. You know, like I was thinking about, okay, what's this is the you know, the example of like exemplary work, how you do this. The idea behind it is you get this type of work relies on coalitions, right? It's that it gets to that sort of AOC point of like, they've got money, we've got people. And you got to rely on that coalition building. So I think like for anybody who's concerned about, you know, if you're arguing for 15 and you're concerned that you're going to get attacked from the left about, well, that's not enough, right? Like I basically was trying to pose this in a way that gives us both the left and the right attacks on this idea of 15.
Yeah.
And for the dealing with the left side of it, it's that we have to utilize the coalition that's available to us. And that's the distinction you make when you're talking about when to hold them and when to fold them, I guess, like on
Fair enough.
advocating for the top level, right? Like you always, like we as a movement need to be advocating for something that is progressive enough or radical enough that it's going to get us to where we genuinely need to be, because a lot of the points that you're making seem to be made from a very humanitarian perspective, right? Like your history with unions and that dimension of it is very people oriented. So sometimes we have to remember where our peers are at in terms of their ability to get somewhere. And so that's why it's going to be hard to make that 1867 or that 20 argument when there is a national program that gives momentum. And that's,
You're right.
Yeah.
You're right. And look, I've worked in a factory. I framed houses.
Yeah.
I get that. And I really never forget where I came from. Um, and so I am honestly interested in advancing that interest. I tell you, on the executive council, since I started, when we get state contracts um, with labor in them, I ask, what are the lowest paid workers paid? And I make no bones about the fact that I'm looking for $15 an hour. And I would say most of the vendors, the vast majority, are in this $13 to $17 range, starting their lowest paid workers. So that's not bad. But there have been a couple that came through at 9.50, 9.75, $8.
Mhm.
And a couple of them came back later on another contract and they upped their rates. So there is a way to impact employers in our state. And now, in the midst of the COVID pandemic and the related economic crisis, we're seeing how many holes there are in the social safety net. And we need to keep our eye on the ball. The COVID crisis is not an excuse to look away. We
Definitely.
need to keep the focus there.
Yeah. And so okay, so that's a good it's a good point. Let's connect all this to coronavirus for a minute. Many people have different ideas of how we should deal with the economic devastation this has already caused and is going to continue to worsen, especially right now. We've seen any variety of solutions, whether it was the temporary addition of 600 to each weekly check distributed through unemployment, which, you know, only a selection of Americans were eligible for until the benefits went up. There was the one-time distribution of the 1,200, which college students didn't get it, and it barely covers rent for most people, or a mortgage payment. That's one time, so very little again. Meanwhile, as these benefits are going away, and the proposed replacements are much worse. Like Republicans suggesting that they want to get it down to 200. Like we're talking about a third of what the initial allocation had been in the first CARES Act. What kind of programs would you implement to solve the economic dimension of this problem within the state if you're governor? And then what kind of programs would you support our national delegation advocate for in DC? Clearly, also, much of this is a drive to reopen and send students back to school. Like, all that whole thing is rooted in a desire to just return to normal. Much of that anxiety is rooted in stagnation, but that stagnation has occurred because of a separate anxiety for economic pressure and lack of certainty about where, how am I going to make rent? How am I going to feed my family? So it's just a lot harder for people to enjoy this time that they have at home with their kids or doing anything that's not working. How do we connect the idea that government should essentially pay to keep things closed down or keep workers at home with the notion that overworking and underpaying a society of wage earners has diverted our attention from caring about our homes and families? The wholesale abdication of responsibility to the working class has been in process since Reagan and Milton Friedman, and that our current crisis has been and will continue to be a vehicle by which policy can show people what a government that works for them and not for profit motives of large donors or industries actually looks like.
So your reference to everyone being anxious and concerned, it's palpable. I talk to people every day. It's how you do a campaign, even during COVID. You're speaking to people and hearing their stories, and everyone is worried. It's hard to enjoy the time home when you're worried about paying rent or your food insecure. So I get that. A lot of the solutions going to have to come from the federal government. This, I think, is an opportunity to push forward a number of creative solutions that have struggled. So we're seeing how how unable our medical system is to deal with a pandemic level crisis. What had been something that was kind of hidden from the middle class family is now open and on them. This is the argument for Medicare for all. This is the time to make that change. That's a federal issue. It's not something I can do as a governor, even if I wanted to, but the federal delegation should be working on that. That's number one. You mentioned the $600 supplement that you only get if you're unemployed and it works through the unemployment system. That $600 is really important, not only to the people who receive it, but to the economy, because those people tend to spend it. I spent it. I'm not getting the 600, but I did get the 1,200 that came. And so we need to figure out better ways of doing it. I think Andrew Yang was probably right with UBI, and we should be talking about that at the federal level. At the state level, again, we mentioned we don't have a state minimum wage. We need one. It should be $15 an hour. We also have the lowest in New England cap on state unemployment benefits. No matter how much you earned before you got laid off, no matter how many dependents you have, you can't get more than $427 a week. That's about $10 an hour. That makes no sense. A number of states have higher caps and allow for add-ons depending if you have dependents or not. That's the model that New Hampshire should follow. We need to figure out what tools the state can provide so that we can grow businesses, attract businesses, support working people in those businesses. And so I think of a couple of things that the state can do. We can make broadband readily available across the state in good quality. That would help build the gig economy more broadly throughout our beautiful state. You could live wherever you wanted and still get good broadband and participate in that part of the economy. We need to make healthcare more readily available. It's mostly a federal issue, but we can do some things with our federally qualified health centers, like the Manchester Community Health Center, on whose board I sat for 6 years. We can build out that network of community health centers that have a lot of federal funding and make healthcare more readily available throughout most of the state and break the tie between being employed and having health insurance. We should have access to health care, whether we're working for an employer for 10 years or we've started our own new business or we just got laid off. All of those folks should have health care. And then we need to invest in Main Street businesses. New Hampshire, this is something that really frosted me. Sununu went out in his first 100 days as governor and tried to attract 100 new large businesses to the state. And his effort was an utter and complete failure. That's not how you bring businesses to New Hampshire. New Hampshire is a state that is ideal for small and medium-sized businesses, and you focus on them. Amazon is never coming to New Hampshire. I hate to say that, but it's not going to happen. And then in the central part of the state, you build commuter rail, which should have been built years ago to facilitate development in Nashua and Manchester. Those are the things I think about.
Yeah, and I think that this is you're getting on and like a really interesting point about, again, it's like each time I'm asking a question about something, it seems like a lot of the stuff you're proposing is about going back to a systems-based approach. You need to repair and improve basic social systems like transportation, like healthcare. Something that I think is really important for everybody to understand is the tie between employment and health insurance. And I always, anytime this comes up, I always want to throw in a bid, right, about this, like just a little quick thing like, hey, oftentimes it's presented as a matter of choice, right? We want to be able to choose the insurance that we have. So that's why we don't do Medicare for all or some sort of single payer system. And
Yeah, that's BS.
right. And here's the thing. You don't have choice. Your employer has choice. Your employer has a certain amount of choice based off of their own economic situation, what type of plan they can go out and get for you. But many jobs I had choice between the bronze, silver, or gold plan, but I couldn't choose between the providers, right? There was no layer of that there. ACA helped a little bit with that, but again, that's about whether or not people were able, like companies were in a position to participate in the ACA. So it's not, it doesn't cover everything. It's not ubiquitous. And I always just want to emphasize, you don't have choice. Most people already have virtually no choice in their health insurance. You got to get it through your employer, and your employer sets that. So don't let anyone convince you otherwise.
Well, I'd go further than that. I don't hear people saying that they love their health insurer.
Right.
They might love their nurse practitioner
Right.
or their doctor, and they're thankful that that person is in network. But health insurance is a means to an end to get me health care with a doctor or a nurse practitioner or optometrist that I like and that I trust. That's what it's about.
Right.
And if you recognize it's the healthcare provider and not the health insurer that's more important, then it allows you to think about this in a different way.
Sure. And then I don't want to hold you for too long if you're starting to run out of time here.
I am. I've got my campaign manager making signals at me. We've crossed the 1 hour
all right,
mark.
Yeah, we're all right. Well, I tell you what, I will let you go right
go
now.
back to one thing that you said.
Okay.
And it was your reference to AOC.
Mm-hmm.
She said that they have the money, we have the people.
Mm-hmm.
We have intentionally funded our campaign in a way that we have the people. We smashed all the records on the number of contributors to our campaign, more than any governor candidate has ever had in both the primary and the general combined.
Mm-hmm.
We have more than that now, partway through the primary. That was very intentional, and I'm very proud of that. We're still way behind Dan in total dollars. He's taking money from everyone, every source you can imagine. We don't take corporate money. We've never exploited the LLC loophole. We do prefer, like, love, respect the small dollar donors, and that's how we've done it.
It's the way to be. It's the way I try to run this channel, and I think that is going to be one of the roots of grassroots campaigns, grassroots media, and just a true movement of left progressivism in this particular state. So, Andru, thank you so much for coming on and taking this time to talk with me today. This was a super wide-ranging.
My great pleasure.
Yeah, awesome.
Thank you for having me. I hope you stay safe. Take good care.
Yeah, you too. You too. Absolutely.
Listening.
Have a good one, Andru. We'll catch up with you soon.
Okay, take care. Bye-bye.
Bye. All right, everyone. That was Andru Volinsky. Big interview. Lots of content. Lots to listen to. I didn't even get to everything that I wanted to get to. That's how that is. The last thing that I wanted to sort of toss in there, and just a last quick thing about health insurance, right? Just so everyone's clear, Andru made the distinction about you like your doctor, but you don't necessarily care about your provider. And the thing about health insurance, when you marketize, like when you monopolize or not do not monopolize on it, but you decide to turn it into a market-based dynamic, right, where you introduce competition, that is purely intended to profit off of restricting access to healthcare for sick people. The money is made off of healthy people. It's then put in a coffer, and then that money is maintained by fighting tooth and nail to not cover crucial surgeries, emergency room visits, you name it. So that entire industry is fundamentally based off of profiting off of people's pain. And that to me is another huge argument for why it should be a government monopoly that's completely controlled through taxation and a process by which we as the public can completely evict people who are abusing the system or operating it incorrectly. And that's absolutely a dimension of we need to deal with campaign finance reform, because we do not live in a perfect democracy right now. Just it happens. So there's a lot of work to be done, but I don't know. I think there's definitely a solid argument to be made that electing Andru Volinsky would push things in that direction, away from the pain and suffering that we experience because of this broken system. So at any rate, Patreon.com/locally sourced. Become a subscriber. Help fund this project. Keep it going. There's a number of goals that I have. I have a lot of ideas for what can be done with this channel. And there's stuff that I really want to explore and I want to really dive into, but I need better space. I need better gear. I want to be able to go full time. Make sure that we can host this kind of stuff more often, go deep, provide something that's missing within the discourse. So definitely becoming a monthly subscriber, as low as $2 a month, you can absolutely help keep this thing alive. Obviously, it doesn't cost anything to become a subscriber, so hit the button down there. You can hit the little bell for notifications, like I said at the top of the show. Again, follow us on Twitter, like us on Facebook, follow us on Instagram. Links are down in the description below. And so cheers, everybody. Tomorrow, going to be doing another deep dive with Jonah, and that's exciting. We're going to be talking about youth voter turnout. So, and mobilizing the youth vote. So that's, if that's something that you care about, I'd recommend tuning in. It will probably be a blast. With that, cheers, everybody. Thank you so much for tuning in today. I really appreciate it. This was one of the most well-attended live streams I've had in a bit. So kudos to that. And thank you so much, everyone, for tuning in and showing support. And catch up with you tomorrow.